Principles and Elements of Design, Part 4, Dominance, Harmony, and Balance. This is Charles Bernard. Throughout this course, you've been learning about drawing, tone, balance, mood, and organization. And here, you're learning even more about how to organize a picture. Forms in a picture, such as, for example, figures or a spaceship, must harmonize with and be carefully related to other objects, whether these forms are large and important or apparently small and trivial. In this way, you will attain a feeling of harmony and the impression that all the elements of the picture belong there. Strength in a picture is achieved through relationship. The related lines need not necessarily be side by side and of the same length. Such an arrangement, as I've shown you and will continue to show you, would result in a rather monotonous-looking composition. A line drawn diagonally across the page may reinforce several shorter lines elsewhere. The relationship would lie in their general similarity of direction rather than in their position of length. You've been learning about the elements of design with which you build pictures with. But these elements of design need to be organized, and therefore you need to learn about the principles of design which organize the elements of design. There have been many artists throughout the centuries who have recognized the importance of the principles of design, as opposed to just painting a picture by some mysterious intuitive guidance that tells the artist what to do. That kind of approach is a subjective approach that can never be as successful as the approach in which the artist learns about the principles of design and gains a deep understanding of them, and then is able to apply them to his or her paintings. The untutored outpouring of ideas and feelings by an artist without any knowledge and understanding of how to organize these things can only result in a bad picture. Your art becomes principled only when principles are applied, and to remain ignorant of them means that your work will be unprincipled and therefore will lack order. And art is man-made order. And if that order doesn't exist within your work, then you don't have a work of art. What you have is chaos. And now it's time for you to learn about these principles of design. And I'll begin with dominance. Now, these elements of design need to be organized, and they are organized by these principles of design that you see here. And I'll mention this again later, just to remind you, so that you don't forget and you begin to realize the importance of what I have just said. When something is told to you once, it is usually forgotten. So therefore, it needs repeating. And this will help you to not only remember, but hopefully, finally, eventually, begin to realize the importance of what is being shown to you and explained to you, so that you will then understand that you have to get these things into your pictures if you want to wind up with a work of art. Now, it's not only these things that you need to get into your pictures, but also the other elements of picture making that I'm going to list later on over here. But to keep it simple, I'm just going to focus on this for now. Now, as I said, I'm going to start off with dominance. And each of these principles, dominance, balance, repetition, unity, harmony, alternation, contrast, gradation, need to be applied to each one of these elements of design: line, shape, texture, color, size, direction, value. This will then organize these elements of design. If you apply line or size or direction or value to your pictures without thinking about these principles of design and applying them to the elements of design, you're going to wind up with a chaotic composition. There won't be any order, and therefore there won't be any work of art. Art is man-made order. Therefore, you can't just paint nature the way you find it, because it's not going to be organized the way it needs to be in order to become a work of art. And to bring that kind of order to your pictures, that's where these principles of design come in. Now let me get back to dominance. So dominance is achieved three ways. And I'll just roughly do a little sketch here and add some shapes. These are angular shapes. And the smaller shape here, like this, is angular. And these shapes are the positive shapes. And this shape here is the negative shape. Both positive and negative shapes are angular shapes. And there are only three kinds of shapes: angular, rectangular, and curving shapes. And I'll mention this again later on, and there's also a video entirely on shapes in which I go into more detail about the three basic kind of shapes, and also mention things about shapes in other videos as well. So you're going to be learning about shapes throughout the course. Shapes are what are going to make or break your pictures to a large extent, because if the shapes are not good, the picture isn't going to look interesting. Good shapes make interesting pictures, but you need to know what makes a good shape, and you'll learn about that later on. But right now, I just want to focus on dominant shapes. So by repeating these angular shapes like this, with no other kind of shapes visible, dominance of shape is achieved. It's achieved by repetition. So I'll just do another angular shape here, like this, and another one here, like that. You see, I'm repeating a shape. Although the shape isn't exactly the same, it's repeated, they all have the same basic angular character to them. Therefore, they're related. And this is one way of achieving dominance, through repetition, by repeating the same basic kind of shape. And that goes for all of the other elements of design here. Repeating a line, repeating the size of something, repeating a particular direction, repeating a value, repeating a particular texture, or a particular color. I'm going to add a curving shape right there. So the curving shape is only one shape, and it is a small shape, while the other shapes, as you know, are angular and larger in size and have been repeated. So they dominate over this smaller curving shape. So there's dominance of shape, which is, of course, the angular shape and not the curving shape. However, if let me just change the hardness of the brush here. If I change this so that these shapes are curving shapes like that, then the curving shapes dominate over this angular shape here. There's only one angular shape, but there are more of the curving shapes. So by repeating these curving shapes, just as I repeated these here, the angular shapes, and created more of these curving shapes through repetition than I did of this angular shape, I therefore have created dominance of shape. And this is how you get dominance of shape into your pictures. This is something that you need to practice over and over until you really are able to get dominance of shape into your pictures. This dominance of shape also establishes unity that you see right over here. That's how you get unity into your pictures, through dominance. Without dominance, you can't establish unity. And dominance is achieved through limitation, which means that you need to limit the number of shapes in your compositions. If I, for example, didn't limit my shapes here to the curving shapes, but rather also introduced more of the angular shapes, as well as this kind of shape that you'll be learning about later on, the rectangular shape. See, it has that rectangular character to it. Then there wouldn't be any dominance if those three different kinds of shapes were pretty much equal in size and number within your composition. So you have to limit yourself to one kind of shape that appears more often than another shape in order to achieve dominance. And that's why I say that dominance is also created through limitation, by limiting yourself to one kind of shape and showing that one kind of shape more often within the composition than any other shape, just like I showed you here, and with the angular shapes. And the same goes for line and direction. You limit yourself to one kind of direction that appears more often than another kind. So, for example, right over here, in this little sketch that I'm doing, I draw these lines, these diagonals like this, and I'm limiting myself now to these diagonals that are dominating as opposed to vertical lines that I'm adding up here. It's this diagonal that is being repeated more often. It becomes the dominant line within this little abstract sketch, because I'm limiting myself to this diagonal, and the verticals here act only as small subservient or subdominant lines, just as this angular shape here is introduced as a subdominant or subordinate shape to the dominant shape. Each shape that you repeat, such as this one and that one and that one, or these down here, each needs to be somewhat different, not too different. If they're too different, then you lose harmony. See right there, harmony? Right now, these shapes are in harmony because each shape is somewhat different. Harmony means that there is a little bit of change occurring within the design element that has been repeated. Not too much change. Remember, if they look too different, then they will not look harmonious. And the shapes should look harmonious. Shapes have a particular character to them. They can be spiky like this. See that spikiness? And again, the shapes all look somewhat similar. So these are the spiky shapes. Then you can have drooping shapes like this. All these shapes you see right here, they have a certain look to them, a certain character that is repeated, although the shapes themselves are not exactly the same. If I took this shape here and I repeated that shape like that, I would wind up with a shape that has been repeated that is exactly the same. And when you do that, then you create a very boring picture. The eye is intrigued and is stimulated by change. Therefore, every shape that you repeat needs to be repeated with some variation, some change in it. Like this shape is different, as I mentioned, from this shape. But it still retains that same drooping kind of character. And that same drooping character repeated throughout the composition will also give unity to your composition, unity to the shapes, because they all have that same basic character to them, which is what unifies them. Now, like I said earlier, you'll be learning more about shapes later on. As you continue to study the course, you'll be introduced again to the importance of shapes and how to create interesting shapes and other things as well that you need to know to produce really great shapes. So many times an art instructor may say, well, you need to create interesting shapes, but they don't tell you how to make those shapes interesting. Many times they don't know themselves. They just repeat what they've heard. You have to make interesting shapes, but they don't tell you how. So that's no good. That kind of teaching is no good. You need to know precisely what it is that makes a shape interesting. And there are many things involved that you'll be learning about. But for now, just focus on what I told you here and try to get this into your practice work. In one of the previous lessons, you learned about dominance of size. I showed you how to get dominance into your composition by making one object or shape or form larger in size than all the others. So if I make a large shape like this, large curving shape, and I have smaller curving shapes down here like this, and another one here, or they could be angular shapes. This is even better. I'll make them angular shapes. So it's not the angular shapes that dominate. It's, of course, the large curving shape that dominates. And it dominates because of the larger size that it has. So I didn't achieve dominance by repeating this curving shape like I did earlier, but I achieved dominance by making the curving shape the largest shape. Now, you can also have this, a large dominant shape like this, but then I can also repeat that same curving shape elsewhere. By the way, these curving shapes that are touching the picture borders here are variations on a strict curving shape, which would be a shape like this, for example, that falls within the picture borders and is not cropped off at the picture borders. By cropping the shape off at the picture borders, I've created a variation of the curving shape like this that includes straight lines. Right here, that's a straight line, and then the straight line over here on this side, which is the border of the picture. So let me just make some changes here, like this. You see? So it has a straight line to it, but it still looks like a curving shape. But it's not a perfect curving shape. It's a variation of the curving shape because I've introduced those straight lines at the edges. I thought of bringing in this wheel of shapes that I created to teach you about harmony of shapes. Study it carefully, and you'll learn that those shapes in which little change occurs are in harmony. However, the greater amount of change that occurs within a shape, the less in harmony it is with another shape. Therefore, these two shapes, the oval and the circle, because they are next to each other, little change can be seen between the circle and the oval, which puts them in harmony. Now, this shape and the circle, they're still in harmony, but because there is a greater change that has occurred between this shape and the circle, they are now in less harmony than this oval and the circle. So the further away shapes get from this circle, the less those other shapes are in harmony with the circle. What I was talking about earlier when I showed you this curving shape with the straight line here and here. So this kind of shape would relate to this one right there because it has a straight line and then a curve to it. And in this example here, there's more of the curve than the straight line. So therefore it relates more to this shape because in this shape there's more of the curve than this straight line here. However, in this shape, it's a different story. There's more of the straight line than the curve, and in this one, there is way more straight line than this curve. And then, of course, down here, where the triangle shape is, the curve has been completely lost. And there is a strong contrast now between this shape and the circle. You can have opposing shapes such as the circle and the triangle and still have them in harmony with each other. You just need to know how that can be done. And you'll be learning about that later on lessons of how to integrate opposing shapes. And not just opposing shapes, but all of the elements of design that oppose each other. How you can bring them into a union. How you can create an alliance between opposing elements of design. I'll give you a brief example here. Now, this circle has a particular value, and you can see that it is a light value within the outline of the circle. This right here is a light value. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to change it to black and white, and you'll be able to see the value better. All right, now you see that it's a light value. The shape down here within its outline has the same light value right there as the circle has. Therefore, because these two shapes share the same light value, an alliance is formed between the opposing shapes. Now, the alliance is weak. You can strengthen the alliance by adding an additional element of design that you repeat in both shapes, which will strengthen the alliance, bring them into a greater union. Integrate the opposing shapes, in other words, which is what design is about. It is about bringing opposing elements of design into harmony and unity. A principle of design is a relationship law or organizational scheme or a plan of organization that combines the elements of design that you see here in only 3 ways. And here are those 3 ways. You can combine the elements of design to form repetition. You can combine them to form similarity, or you can combine them to form novelty, which means that contrast is introduced. Now, I'm going to be talking more about this later, and I'll be showing you some concrete examples and going into this in more detail, but right now I just want to point out to you the 3 ways in which the elements of design or whatever images or objects you use in your pictures can be combined. I'll be talking a lot about the fact that these principles of design that you see here must dominate over the various parts of a composition. That is, those parts which are comprised of line, shape, texture, color, size, direction, and value that you see here must be subordinated to the principles of design. It is the principles that must dominate over the parts. All visual design may be reduced to 7 elements of design that you see here, and 8 principles of design that you see here. I should note, however, that there are additional elements of design as well as principles of design, but I've excluded them here in order to simplify things and not to overwhelm you with too much in the beginning. But it is basically these elements of picture making, as they are referred to, that I'm concerned with here in the beginning of this course, while I'll be adding additional ones as the course continues. But it is these that are the main elements of picture making that you first really need to learn and understand and apply to your work. Some of the additional elements of design are, for example, edges, space, and form, for example. There are many more involved, but as I said, you'll learn about them later. First, I just want to focus on these main principles of design. As I stated earlier, a principle of design is a law of relationship or a plan of organization that determines the way in which the elements must be combined to accomplish a particular effect. And I'll be repeating this again later on. As I mentioned, there's a lot to learn, a lot to remember, and therefore it's important that these things are repeated throughout the course. This is a complete art course that you're taking. It's not like watching a video that's 1 or 2 hours long. Now let's start with dominance. Without dominance, there is conflict. Dominance resolves conflict. So if I have a dark here and a lighter value here, there's conflict between the dark and the light. However, if one value is larger, like this, and the lighter value is smaller, now there's dominance because this dark takes up much more area than this smaller light value. So this is one way of achieving dominance. Dominance through size. Dominance is also achieved by repeating an element like this. And I'll add another dark here, and then another dark over here. But now I'll add a white. Which value do you think dominates? Of course, it's the dark value, because there is more of this dark value than there is of the white. And more of that dark value is gained through repeating that dark value. This kind of dominance through repetition results in accumulated size, because when you keep repeating something, it accumulates, and what you wind up with is more of it, and because of that, it dominates over that which there is less of, like here with this white value. There's less of that white value than there is of the dark value. So here's an example of dominance through repetition. The third and final way through which dominance is achieved is through strength of contrast. So let's say I have this middle value here, and then I add a darker value right there, like that. And then up here, I'll add a real dark value, and then over that dark value, I'll add this white. It is this part here that dominates over this part. Here, the strength of value contrast is not as strong as it is over here, and therefore it is this that dominates over this. So here's an example of dominance through strength of contrast. Whenever you have a really strong contrast that draws your attention to it, dominance is achieved. So it doesn't necessarily need to be strong value contrasts. It can be strong color contrasts. I'll add this grayed orange color over here like that. And then I'll add an orange color that is slightly brighter like this. And now I'll add a really bright orange color. This is where the dominance is, because this bright, intense orange color contrasts strongly with the more grayed orange color in back of it. While down here, this color contrast is much less. And because of that, this part doesn't dominate. But where the color contrast is stronger, right here, that's where dominance is created. Here I used value as an example on how dominance is achieved. Later I'll be showing you other examples with other elements of design such as shape. The principle of dominance proclaims the need for the resolution of a conflict between the opposing forces. These elements of design are considered forces. And when they are in conflict, when they contrast with each other strongly, then that conflict needs to be resolved by having one dominate over the other. Here's a red color, and then I'll add, I think, a blue. There's conflict between these two colors. There's no resolution of the conflict because both of them command equal attention. In order for dominance to be established, one or the other must be increased in size, for example, so that it dominates in terms of size over the other. But there's still a problem because they are still in conflict in terms of the intensity or saturation of the color. Both have equal intensity, or both have equal saturation or chroma. So therefore, one of these colors needs to be reduced in its intensity. And what I'll do is reduce the intensity of the blue. And I'll gray that color like this. And now, the conflict in terms of the intensity of color has been resolved by making one color grayer, while the other remains intense. So what I have here is dominance of saturation, or dominance of intensity of color, because this color takes up a greater area and is of a less intense color than this one is. I've established dominance of saturation. Right now, I'm keeping things simple and more abstract. Later, you'll be seeing more realistic examples of what I'm talking about here. But first, it's important that you understand these things in very simple terms, which will help you to then later understand more complicated images much better. I want to move on to balance, another important principle of design. We are easily bored. We can easily get too much of anything. Emotionally, we demand relief whenever monotony threatens. We demand the play of opposing forces. And these opposing forces, like for example, if I have a dark value here, it needs to be opposed by a light value. If I have a red color over here, it needs to be opposed by an opposing force, which could be a yellow. If I have a busy texture like this, it needs to be opposed by a smooth texture like this. The two textures oppose each other. Since you're balancing opposing forces, you need to know just how much of each force is needed to balance the opposing force. How much light value do I need to balance the dark? Or how much dark value do I need in relation to the light value to balance it? Or how much of a busy texture do I need to balance a quieter texture? This refers to the idea of proportion. And proportion means how much of a force is needed to balance a counterforce. There's also the idea of the strength of the force that is used, whether it is strong enough to balance an opposing force. Always think of the elements of design as forces that need to be balanced. And think of balance in terms of oppositions. When the opposing forces are balanced, the result is equilibrium. You won't have equilibrium unless you have balanced opposing forces. If you look at this rough sketch here, you can see that it is bottom heavy. A dark value like this feels heavy compared to a lighter value like that. So to bring the two shapes into balance, I can place some dark within the light value and then some light value into the dark value like that. And now there's a balance here. When you look at this example here, you see opposing forces. But are they really in balance? They're not really in balance because the amount of area that the busy texture takes up is pretty much the same amount that the quiet texture takes up. The busy texture actually has more weight than the quiet texture does. Therefore, in order for there to be a balance between these opposing forces, the more quiet area needs to be enlarged so that it can then balance the more busy area. It would look something like this, for example. Here I have a busy area, and that area can be smaller in size because it has a lot of visual weight. It attracts a lot of attention. So therefore, the more quiet area needs to be larger in size to equal the smaller, more busy area, so that a balance can be achieved between these opposing forces. And it's a matter of judgment. You have to judge just how large this quiet area of texture needs to be in relation to the smaller busy texture. Here's a quick rough color sketch that I did to demonstrate to you the importance of adding an opposing force. Right now, you can see that here on the left side is where all the activity is. This is the busy area, compared to the right side here, which is the quiet area. This quiet area was introduced to balance the more busy area. If I had the same amount of busyness on the right side that I have on the left side, I wouldn't have any balance by way of the introduction of an opposing force, which is a quiet area. It would look like this. And here you can see that there isn't a quiet area to balance the more busy area. Think of balance in terms of applying opposing forces to your compositions. So therefore, in order to achieve balance of texture here, I need to return the painting to the way it was before. Now I have balance of texture, a quiet texture opposing a busy texture. The whole idea is to think in terms of opposites and apply them to your paintings. Straight line opposing a curved line, an angular shape opposing a curved shape, a busy texture opposing a quiet area or quiet texture, a warm color opposing a cool color, a light value opposing a dark value. The stronger the opposing forces are, the more dramatic the picture will appear. Right now, this picture looks like it's split down the middle. It looks like there are two pictures there, which is something you shouldn't do. You don't want your painting to look like two different paintings. Therefore, the subject that you have needs to be distributed throughout the picture area. If you do what I did here, then it will look like two different pictures. Balance also refers to the equal distribution of weight. And weight in art has to do with how much attention something attracts. The more attention it attracts, the heavier the weight. And while it's not actual weight, in art, this kind of attraction is called visual weight. So the more something attracts you through contrast, the more visual weight it will have. And that visual weight needs to be balanced by an opposing weight that balances the other weight. Now in this example here, this part has visual weight, more visual weight than this part here. The activity that is seen here attracts more attention than this part here, and therefore this part has more weight, or more visual weight. That means that some change has to occur here in order to balance all of this visual weight over here. Right now, the two sides are not in balance. There's more weight on the left than there is on the right. First of all, what has to be done is the proportions have to be changed. This size here is 2 equal to this size. So therefore, I'm going to cut down on the right side here, like that. Now there's much better proportion. There's more of this area than there is of this area. And this difference in sizes helps to add a lot of interest. I still have a nice balance of opposing forces. I still have this quiet area, and then I have the busy area. Within this quiet area, I can introduce something that has greater visual weight than it has now, in order to balance this better. And what I could do, for example, is add a darker value. That darker value has more weight than the lighter value that was there. Now there's more weight on this side that balances all of this visual weight on the left side. I also added this, which attracts a certain amount of attention, and therefore it has a certain amount of visual weight. A good way to achieve balance is through the principle of alternation or interchange. And I'll demonstrate that here in this little diagram. So here's a dark area. It corresponds to the dark area in my painting. And then over here, a larger, lighter value. And to achieve better balance between the two areas, what can be done is to place some of that lighter value into the darker value, and then some of the darker value into the lighter value, like that. And this helps to create balance. You can see this sort of thing in my painting here. Right here, you can see that I introduced some light value within the dark. And I could even strengthen that light value a little bit more, like this. And then what I'm going to do is place a little bit of dark over here within the light value. Or I could even place the dark value down here, as long as there's some dark value over here within the lighter value, just like I established over here. And this helps to create a better balance. In this diagram, as well as in my painting here, you can see that the idea of proportions has been applied, or as it's also referred to as extension. How much dark do you add in order to balance a larger area of lighter value? Does this amount of dark balance this larger lighter area? Or maybe that dark needs to be reduced in size. Something like this maybe. It's a matter of feeling whether balance has been achieved or not. Do you need to add more dark or less dark? So if I add less dark in my painting here like this, does the painting now balance better than it did before? Or maybe I need to add more dark like this. There's no exact science that you can apply. You have to go by your feeling. Does it balance or doesn't it? If it feels right, then leave it alone. Through balance, you also are able to establish unity and harmony when there is an equal distribution of weight throughout the entire picture area. So if I have a light value over here, and then I have a light value here and a light value here, I'm distributing that light value around the picture area, and this helps to create unity. And when the values are similar and distributed around the picture area, then harmony is the result. It's this distribution of the elements of design around the picture area so that they are seen not in just one place, but all around the picture area, that establishes balance, and therefore harmony and unity. Remember that the opposing forces that you add need to be balanced. Equilibrium refers to the balancing of opposing forces. So here I have a busy area, and that has quite a bit of visual weight, and it needs to be balanced. So I add an opposing force, and that opposing force, of course, will not be a busy area. It will be a quiet area like this, like I showed you in my painting here. Now I have to judge. Is this quiet area large enough to balance all of this visual weight on the left side? Or do I need to make that quiet area even larger, or maybe smaller? This is where proportion comes in. The areas need to be proportioned correctly in order for balance to be able to be achieved. So this is a balance of texture, but then of course there's balance of line, balance of shape, and balance of color, and balance of size and direction and value. And each of these elements of design needs to have its opposing force. Let's say I have color, and what I'll do is just quickly add this blue color, and to balance this blue I need an opposing color. Now what color would oppose the blue? Is complementary, which is orange. Think in terms of complementary colors as the opposing colors that will establish balance through opposition. So now I add this smaller area of orange. Now the question is, does this smaller area of orange balance the larger area of blue? Warmer colors seem to appear heavier than cooler colors. Therefore, to balance a larger, cooler area, it's best to use a smaller, warmer area like this. While I have balance of hue, I don't have balance of color saturation or intensity, or color chroma as it's also referred to. Color has 3 dimensions. However, it's best to also think of temperature as another dimension. So 4 dimensions. There's value, there's intensity, there's temperature, and there's hue. Hue is the actual color, the name of the color. What is needed here is an opposing intensity of color. Both of these intensities of color, or color saturation, are the same. They're both pure colors that haven't been altered in terms of making one less intense than the other. So what I'll do is I'll reduce the intensity of the blue like this. Make it more of a grayed blue. Now I've added an opposing intensity of color, where I have one bright color, which is the orange, and then one more grayed color of less intensity. While you're thinking of balance in terms of applying opposing forces like I've been showing you, these opposing forces, however, need to be balanced. So in this example, I have the right amount of bright orange that balances the larger area of cooler, grayer color. The opposing forces have been balanced, and therefore there is an equilibrium. Equilibrium means balancing opposing forces. Remember, if you add a vertical line, you need to add an opposing line, like a horizontal that opposes the vertical. If you have a curve, add a straight line which opposes the curve. If you have a dark, make sure you oppose that dark. Add an opposing force by adding a lighter value. You have, let's say, a green in your painting. Add an opposing color, like a red. And you see the different proportions here? Always keep proportions in mind. They need to be different. Don't make them equal, like this. Equal sizes. One needs to dominate over the other, because if you make them both the same size like this, you wind up with conflict. Dominance needs to be applied in order to resolve this conflict. So if I make one area larger like that, the conflict has been resolved in terms of size. But then there's conflict of the intensity of color. Both of these colors have the same intensity of color. So therefore, one needs to be reduced in its intensity, and I think I'll reduce the intensity of the red. And now the green appears more saturated or more intense. So it's the more intense color of the green that is dominant, while the more grayed red color becomes subordinate. The conflict between the two intensities has been resolved by making one grayer and the other remains more saturated or intense in color. I think I can gray the red even more so that the green appears more intense. Like this. You see, by doing that, the green now appears more saturated.